Today, if you couldn't tell, we're talking about Venom. And don't get me wrong by the title, I love the character. He's actually one of my top 3 favorite Marvel characters, those of which including Ghost Rider and Wolverine. But I just kind of wanted to sit back and dive a little bit into what is wrong with the character in media. Not specifically the character in writing, because that would be complaining about the character itself, but I really just want to talk about different interpretations. Because these days we kind of have a deviated version of Venom. We now kind of replace details as time goes on with things that are cool aside from what things are technically right about the character. And I know that happens all the time. That's not something that's completely new, but we've seen so many different versions of this character outside of the comic book media that I kind of have reason to talk about it personally. I'll get a little bit into it at the end of the video as to why I'm particularly making this video. Let's get started. Without getting too deep into the details of Venom's conception in total, what's important to make out when Todd McFarlane originally created the character is that he wanted to create a monster. Much like the Joker with Batman, Venom is supposed to be the dark reflection of Spider-Man. Whether it's ideology or aesthetic, Venom is the version of Spider-Man, a young and hopeful hero that is for the people, that crosses any and all boundaries, as expressed in stories such as What If Peter Parker Kept a Symbiote and Deadly Neighborhood Spider-Man. Based on the original arc of the character, Venom wouldn't be what he is without Spider-Man. In a visual sense, Spider-Man is very uniform and he's usually striking to the people, whilst Venom is beastly, dark, and unnerving. But in a more technical sense, Venom also gets his look, symbol, skill, and signature abilities from Spider-Man, meaning that it is that much more Spider-Man's responsibility to stop Venom and to rewrite his wrongs, which is something that I'm going to be circling back to a lot throughout this video. These ideas and concepts are usually pushed further when the character or host of Venom is written to be someone that has any kind of tension with Peter and or Spider-Man. You then have a stacked conflict where Spider-Man has to defeat Venom, save the host, right any of his wrongs, and make amends with the host and hopefully correct any tension between the two characters, which usually doesn't happen. There are countless hosts that we can go over, but the 3 most significant that I'm going to talk about today are Edward Brock Jr., Matt Gargan, and as of recently, Harry Osborn. All 3 of these characters in some way share one thing, and that one thing is delusion. With Eddie Brock, his delusion stems from revenge. He seems to believe that Peter Parker and Spider-Man have taken everything from him. There's always different versions of this. In most cases, it's a combination of a love interest, the job at the Daily Bugle, and his dignity.
That's rough, buddy.
Obviously, these things aren't always true, but again, it's a delusion because he doesn't want to face facts. So when he bonds with the symbiote and becomes Venom, Eddie is always going after Peter with the intention to eliminate him and essentially take his place so that he can have all of those things back, whether it's a love interest with Gwen Stacy, whether it's the head photographer job at the Daily Bugle, and just to, boost his ego a little bit. And this is of course talking about the original version of Eddie Brock. We're not talking about where he is now in the comic books. And then there's Matt Gargan. Matt Gargan was a very shortly lived version of Venom, but to some people who were really into the Dark Avengers and any audiences like me who kind of enjoyed that short-term, really gritty version of Venom, you might really resonate with this character a little bit more. But Matt Gargan is most notably known as Scorpion, and he originally became Scorpion because he was, in most cases, a prisoner that J. Jonah Jameson bails out and hires him to don this suit that's essentially supposed to make him an anti-version of Spider-Man. And his delusion, while it is kind of a stretch, really stems from the fact that he just has a score to settle with Spider-Man. At first it's just like a job and a gig, but after countless times of being defeated by Spider-Man at some point, he just grows this grudge against Spider-Man and he wants to, finish this fight and eventually come out on top, which he believes Venom helps him in some sorts when the two bond together. And then lastly, there's Harry Osborn. This one's also a bit of a stretch, but let me explain. His delusion stems from conviction. Because the version of Harry we're talking about is Insomniac's Harry Osborn from Spider-Man 2. This version of Harry Osborn wants to honor his late mother and use his father's riches and resources to heal the world. He's essentially using science to solve all of the world's problems, whether it's as small as insects in the ecosystem to large economical problems with society. But as Harry saves Peter and Peter ends up taking the symbiote for himself, Peter quickly starts to change. Harry, in his dying moments, or just in his dying state, I guess, starts to believe that Peter is not going to help him and Peter's out for himself. But he's not realizing that Peter's changing because of the symbiote, because Harry didn't face those changes like Peter did. So when Harry does come back together with the symbiote and creates Venom, Harry is out to fulfill his duties and heal the world, while Venom is kind of manipulating that mindset in order to take over the world. So they both have similar ideas, but they're just kind of going about it in different ways. Like all of these three, what makes a good host narrative-wise is a host that believes that they're weak or they're lacking in some way. And when bonding with the symbiote and creating Venom, they believe that they are better. On the other half, there's the Clintar, aka the symbiote, which in a sense is just as equally delusional. As a parasite that requires a host to be whole, the Clintar on many occasions feels rather lonely. Most Clintars in writing tend to move from host to host, but at some point always have a favorite. In this one's case, it's usually Eddie Brock. When the Clintar picks a favorite, it will usually do whatever it can to keep the host alive. There have been some cases when the host has been practically immortal so that the Clintar won't be lonely. Now, with all of this being said, when have we actually seen this done right? Looking at these details from the source material, we can examine some of the interpretations over the years and see what each one has done right, and possibly what's wrong with each of them. Let's start with the simple one. Spider-Man the Animated Series. I almost don't even want to bring this one up because in my mind, this Venom is damn near perfect. This version of Venom almost hits all of the marks properly. An accurate version of Eddie Brock, proper symbiote origins, good beats and tension between Eddie Brock and Peter Parker, and so on. It also just helped that in this case, we had a satisfying performance by Hank Azaria. Sorry if I mispronounced that name, but regardless, personally, I do give this version of Venom a whole 10 out of 10, but I don't want to sit around this one for too long, so let's just move on. Next up is the movie interpretation of Venom. This might be one of my most controversial opinions by far, but I don't like this Venom. Let me explain. In simple terms, have you ever seen the Catwoman movie starring Halle Berry? If you have, think about how different Patience Phillips is from the DC accurate Selena Kyle.
I'm sorry, what was that? Allergies?
That's kind of how I feel about this Venom compared to the Marvel accurate Venom. On paper, this version of Eddie Brock is not Eddie Brock. He doesn't hit any of the beats. There's no tension between him and another character that inspires or fuels the personality of Venom in any way, like the original version of Venom has with Peter Parker. And his livelihood and the job and his personality and his hobbies and just the way the character is written is so different that they could have just slapped a different name on the character and just tried to get away with a new version or maybe even a new dimension of Venom. Don't get me wrong, I understand that Tom Hardy and the original director worked really hard on making this version of Venom, especially for live action, which could have been tricky, it being his first movie and not specifically tied to any other Marvel movie at the time. But as someone who's just been a longtime fan of the character, it just strays too far. One minor detail that I think affects both movies to a strong degree is simply the fact that Tom Hardy plays both Venom and Eddie. I'm sure there's many reasons why they went this route. I truly believe that as two different entities, there should have been two different actors. I understand that one's purely just through voiceover and it's hard to build chemistry that way, if it's even necessary. There's also other problems that they have that progress in the second movie, like their specific relationship to each other, such as the fact that they become almost romantical in a sense.
Come over here and kiss me on my hot mouth. I'm feeling romantical.
And it doesn't even stop there. A lot of these mistakes are even pushed over to Carnage as a character as well. Woody Harrelson not only plays Cletus Cassidy, but he plays the voice of Carnage. And even there, they get their chemistry wrong. Carnage is supposed to be so much more further into the ideas of a relationship or obsession that the character Eddie Brock and or Venom never really get into. In the comic books, like I stated before, the symbiote of Carnage has not only kept Cletus Cassidy alive for so long, but has even brought him back from the dead countless times. Large part that Cletus Cassidy kind of has something to do with the conception of Carnage in a very small degree, but in general, they just have a more obsessive relationship, like they can't live without each other, which they also ruin in the movie because at the end, Carnage kind of reveals that he's just using Cletus Cassidy and that in some way they're not on the same playing field, which couldn't be further from the truth, because if anything, Carnage would be doing whatever he could to make sure that both him and Cletus are on the same playing field because they love each other that much. Maybe more in a metaphorical sense, but it still stands. So for Carnage as a symbiote itself, being willing to toss Cletus to the side as it was talking about doing at the end of the movie just doesn't necessarily sit right with me. And just to wrap up these movies in general, I just didn't really care for the fact that this second movie kind of leans into a rom-com type scenario, because in all honesty, the two movies kind of just become more goofy and more fun than they should be. Regardless, let's move on. Next, I would like to talk about the Harry Osborn version of Venom from Insomniac's Spider-Man 2.
Please.
All 19 inches of Venom. Was that joke ever overused? Is it to that point to where no one really cares about it? I don't know, I still think it's funny. This version of Venom is not only the most recent version of Venom, but he's probably going to be one of the most memorable versions of Venom. It's a fresh take on the character while touching on a few of the important traits of Venom. It's also interesting seeing a character like Harry be the host this time. And in that, I mean a character that's kind of an all good kind of character resorting to his darkest corner. The biggest flaw about this version of Venom is that they go too big too fast. And I understand why they do this, and I understand that technically it is comic book accurate, because in recent versions of Venom, including King in Black and so on and so forth, with the invasion of Null and the symbiotes, Venom does grow wings and he does become much more overpowered. Even now, his son Dylan is currently like the trademark Venom, and Eddie Brock is like the king of symbiotes. But again, that's also very recent in comic books, and I understand that they went with this approach for Venom in Spider-Man 2 because the director even explained to IGN that they're not always thinking about the next game. They don't always know how their current game's going to perform, and they don't know how it'll be received, so they want to always go as big as possible, which is understandable. But it does seem like they have plans, at least they teased Carnage in the game. Sorry, spoiler alerts. So it seems strange that of the two characters, they would choose Venom to be the big godlike character before they even get to Carnage. I talked about this with my brother Brandon in a Spider-Man video that I just posted recently. You can go check that out. But in that video, we kind of talk about how Venom would have seemed much more interesting standalone if he was a more horror-like character. And what I mean by that is in the first Spider-Man game, a very interesting dynamic and pacing. I don't know how you would explain that. Taskmaster is my point. Taskmaster was never like a super sequenced point of the game. He was always random. He would show up at different points in the city and he would surprise the character and make a spontaneous like interaction or fight between Spider-Man and Taskmaster, which I think was kind of a missed opportunity with Venom. I think Venom should have been that new character that when the city gets dark or it gets foggy, at random points of Peter or Miles completing tasks, Venom would just randomly appear, and every time you'd fight him, he'd get a little bit more difficult, so that at the end of the game, when there was a main boss fight with Venom, it would be both Peter and Miles teaming up, much like the cinematic trailer that they released. Again, I don't want to get too much into this because I talked about it verbatim with Brandon on that other video, so go make sure to watch that if you want to hear more about it. There are some good things about this version of Venom that I think correct some of the issues we've been looking for prior. Like in this sense, they fixed one of the Tom Hardy issues that I was mentioning about the performance itself. They broke up the performance between two actors. Graham Phillips played Harry Osborn and Tony Todd played Venom. Yes, this could be just as simple as Tony Todd had a cool voice and they wanted him to be the voice of the symbiote, but it still fixes it. There's a huge distinction and tone change when you go from Harry to Venom. Not only does it feel like they kind of have chemistry together, I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but it shows in the game. It shows that they're kind of, I don't know if this was the case for anyone else, but when I was playing the game and I would hear the symbiote's voice with Peter, it was almost unnerving and it didn't match up, and you were constantly like, these two shouldn't be together. And when Harry becomes Venom and he bonds with the symbiote and you hear the two voices together, it's almost seamless, if that makes any sense. And I know I said this already, but again, I don't want to dig too deep into this version of Venom because there's one more Venom I want to cover before I conclude this video. So let's move on. If it wasn't much of a controversial topic to say that I didn't like the Tom Hardy version of Venom, this one's definitely going to strike a chord with some of you, whether it's good or bad. There is one interpretation of Venom that is my favorite and what I truly believe, biased aside, is the closest retelling of Venom, and that is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3. With the questionable choice of performance by Topher Grace, I'd argue that Sam Raimi established the closest rendition of Venom's source material to date and checks all boxes, and the most important ones. Edward Brock Jr. is written almost perfectly as a new challenger to Peter Parker at the Daily Bugle, with not only the intention to impress J. Jonah Jameson, but to use that as fuel to impress the girl he's into, Gwen Stacy, when Peter Parker, both as himself and as Spider-Man, strips that potential away by exposing Brock's false works and pulling Gwen away. This encourages Eddie to act revenge onto Peter Parker. This leads us to delusion. Eddie is so delusional that Peter is the true cause of his downfall and denies responsibility for what he's done. Him having this close quarters tension with Peter, on top of the fact that Peter is the host prior to Eddie, adds to Venom being Spider-Man's creation, in a metaphorical sense, of course. This next one needs a little bit more context, so bear with me for a second. Todd McFarlane himself has said that something he admires about both Hardy and Todd versions of Venom is that they get the hulking size right and that they look more like a monster.
So let me tell you the first thing that I always look for, given that I was the visual creator of him, is I intentionally made him bigger than an average superhero, right? And so, again, not seeing any other characters in there. He looks big. Yeah. He's big, broad shoulders. So I go, if you now put an average person, and he's at least 20, 30, 40, 50% bigger than an average person, even Iron Man, then I go, yes. For me, that's a giant point. Now, when he flares and he's got his teeth, I like it when the teeth aren't all lined up and they look like these are like monsters.
But this is just the look. In the comics and the animated series, the only reason Venom is his size is because Eddie Brock was a bodybuilder. Yes, this Eddie isn't a bodybuilder, nor did they get an actor close to that build. But it emphasizes the next important aspect of Eddie, which is how weak he is, or at least how much he believes he is. He resorts to God in order to take care of Peter in his darkest moment.
I want you to kill Peter Parker.
It is then and there that his prayers are answered. What Eddie is lacking and the void he has within is then filled with the presence of the symbiote. Then there's the Clintar itself. Like the comics, this version of the symbiote does what it needs to, transferring both the abilities and look of Spider-Man onto the host that is now Eddie Brock. The symbiote also follows another niche trait from the source material, such as being able to bypass Peter's spider senses, as seen here. Something else that the Venom movies got wrong, and this movie does right, is that Eddie and the symbiote come together as one to create Venom.
From now on, we're poison to you, Spider-Man. That's why we call ourselves Venom.
The Clintar itself is not named Venom.
I am Venom.
As Venom, they represent a dark reflection of Spider-Man and definitely cross that line that Peter works so hard to stay away from. Lastly, and surely not least, is the combined concept of both loneliness and addiction. Now that Brock believes he has lost Gwen and is lonely, the symbiote is equally as lonely, so they work together to fuel this idea that they need each other. If you've seen the movie, you'll probably remember very well how Eddie's story ends in the movie. And it shows a great leap of not only affection, but addiction.
Peter, what are you doing? No!
Eddie tries so hard to leap into the explosion, thinking that Peter's taking it away from him again. All of these things creates a complex situation for Peter where he has to defeat Venom, save Eddie, and right all wrongs done by Venom because he's been in their shoes and has that feeling that what's happening is his own responsibility. This is obviously made even more difficult when not only Mary Jane is thrown into the mix of this whole encounter, but Sandman is essentially having a giant temper tantrum. I would agree that some choices like the high-pitched scream, the voice being just a slightly adjusted version of Topher Grace's voice, and other things might seem rather strange. But I'd also argue that these do help make Venom seem more like an alien rather than just a beastly version of Spider-Man. I also like some of the other creative liberties with the character, like the final design being even closer to resemble Spider-Man than usual. It's probably the closest we'll ever get to a live-action Spider-Man copycat. A couple other small details that I also really enjoyed that are pretty important in the original comic books is the blackouts that a host has early in their possession, and also the influence the symbiote has on its host, mainly shown when Peter goes all Bully Maguire on us.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
Maybe that wasn't the best representation of that, but it's still technically accurate. I understand this movie has not held up well with other people, but if you're like me or even my twin brother who binge watches all of those movies throughout in like one sitting, not only is it still true to form and it works so well for that movie, but if you put them side by side and you pick out the really abstract and important details about the character, Sam Raimi hits more of those boxes than anyone's done so far. And I think the biggest thing that distracts people from all of those things is purely just the visual performance of the character, which I can agree does stray a little too far. But there are some things to keep in consideration, like if you're looking for a hulking version of Venom, technically, if you do look closely, the symbiote does make Topher Grace a little larger than Peter Parker. And yes, I get it. It's kind of a goofy movie. I guess in a really biased way of saying it, we're still talking about it till this day, and the movie came out almost 20 years ago. In conclusion, again, this is all just subjective and it's all just my opinion. And you're all welcome to share yours in the comments. But I just believe that Venom is such a staple that just comes in and out of media that it's important to point something out like this and maybe even compare and contrast all of them, or as many as possible. But I still don't feel like we've gotten Venom perfect yet, unless we're talking about the animated series, of course. I know it's difficult and they may never get the character perfect on the big screen. And I also understand that everyone has different preferences and they all have different ideas of the character and what they prefer in the character. But it's just another situation that happens a lot in movies and all kinds of different media where there's so much reference and so much source material that's based to be pulled off of that it wouldn't hurt to just do that. It wouldn't hurt to do the character right. Honestly, and I know this is for someone on a small YouTube channel to say, but I don't think anyone's ballsy enough to do it. But I do think that we're in a time now with rated R comic book movies and really exciting projects, excluding what Marvel's been doing recently. There are no excuses. There's no reason we haven't gotten the right Venom yet. out of all of these, which one was your favorite? Or is there one that I didn't bring up that's your favorite? I know a lot of people are a fan of the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon, and a lot of people like that version of Venom. So just let me know what you think. I would love to talk about this with you guys. But I'm just going to, cut it there. That's my 2 cents on the whole Venom situation. I kind of rushed this video. I've had it written for a long time, but I've cut a lot out and I didn't end up wanting to make a really long video. So I hope that doesn't show too much in the final cut. There is like someone screaming outside right now, but I have some content I'm getting ready for you guys. Please stand by for that. I hope you all had an amazing day, night, week, whenever you're watching this, and fingers crossed for an amazing 2024. I love you all. Bye. Oh, you're still here? Okay. For those who stuck around, should I do it? You think I can? I've been practicing a little bit. Ready?
We are Venom.
That was lame.